Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The calm before the storm. Ava Robinson walked through the bustling terminal of the airport with the quiet confidence of a woman who had just reached the pinnacle of her career. The polished leather of her shoes clicked softly against the marble floors, each step measured and purposeful. She moved with a kind of grace that only comes from years of discipline and focus. Every piece of her attire spoke volumes: the tailored black suit that hugged her frame, the hint of gold peeking from her earrings, and the soft glow of the watch that circled her wrist, an emblem of her success. Ava was no stranger to the world of high-powered business. As a successful entrepreneur, she had built her empire from the ground up. Today, however, was a special day. She had just closed one of the biggest deals of her career, a multi-million-dollar contract that promised to elevate her company to new heights. It was a win not only for her business but also for her as a Black woman navigating a corporate world that had often tried to exclude her. She had worked tirelessly, fighting through barriers, biases, and obstacles that many others didn't even know existed. But today, as she walked through the airport, there was a sense of fulfillment. She had achieved something monumental, and she was about to celebrate it in style. Her flight was to a luxurious tropical destination, the perfect escape to recharge before she dived into the next chapter of her work. As she passed through the terminal, the airport seemed to part before her, the chaos of travelers and announcements fading into the background. Ava had always carried herself with an air of elegance and professionalism, and today, it was even more pronounced. It wasn't arrogance. It was the quiet confidence of a woman who had earned her place. She approached the first-class lounge, where she would wait for her flight. As she passed through the entrance, she noticed the subtle glances of other passengers, some with envy, some with admiration. Ava had grown used to these fleeting looks. She was used to being the only Black woman in the room, and yet, she never let it faze her. She had spent years making space for herself in the business world, and now she was here, in this space, ready to enjoy the fruits of her labor. Ava glanced at her phone to check the time. Her flight was still an hour away, plenty of time to relax and unwind. She made her way to a plush lounge chair and set her briefcase down beside her. As she sat, she closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The weight of the deal she had just closed seemed to settle onto her shoulders in a way that felt both satisfying and surreal. But in the midst of her quiet triumph, there was a subtle undercurrent, an awareness that, despite her success, the world around her was not always as welcoming as it seemed. For years, Ava had navigated a world that often tried to define her by the color of her skin rather than the weight of her intellect. She had learned early on that her achievements would never be enough to shield her from the subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices that others carried. Still, she had pushed forward, not letting the prejudice or microaggressions define her journey. Just as Ava began to relax, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from her husband, Derek. They had been married for 5 years, and he had been her rock through every storm. Derek's support was unwavering, and it had been a cornerstone of Ava's success. His message was simple: "I'm so proud of you, baby. I love you. Can't wait to celebrate tonight." Ava smiled, a genuine smile that softened the hard edges of her day. She typed back a quick reply: "Love you too. I'm so ready to unwind." She set the phone down and leaned back into the plush chair, closing her eyes for a moment longer. The next hour passed by in a blur of quiet anticipation. Ava had become accustomed to traveling in luxury. But as the time to board approached, she felt a twinge of excitement. There was something special about this flight. Maybe it was the victory she had just claimed. Or maybe it was the sense of peace that settled in her heart knowing she had earned every step of the way. When the call for boarding came, Ava stood up and grabbed her briefcase. She walked confidently toward the gate, her heart light, her mind focused. As she approached the gate, she noticed a man standing by the boarding desk. His uniform was crisp, but his demeanor didn't match the professional setting. He was a pilot, or so his uniform suggested, with the captain's insignia gleaming on his chest. His presence was imposing, not because of his stature, but because of the way he carried himself, like he was used to being in control. Ava's attention was briefly diverted to the screen above the gate, where her flight number was listed. She was ready for a smooth transition from business mode to relaxation. However, something in the air felt off as she approached the desk. The pilot, who had been speaking to a ground attendant, seemed to stiffen as she got closer. His eyes swept over her with a look that was hard to ignore. Ava paused for a moment, uncertainty creeping into her mind. "Excuse me, ma'am," the pilot's voice rang out, stopping her in her tracks. Ava turned, expecting to hear something routine, perhaps a greeting or an instruction. Instead, what she heard was a tone that dripped with skepticism. His gaze was fixed on her with an almost unsettling intensity. "May I see your boarding pass?" he asked. Ava's brow furrowed slightly. Of course, she had already checked in, and she had the boarding pass ready in her hand. She handed it over with the same calm confidence that had gotten her this far. But the pilot's response was not what she expected. He glanced at the pass for a moment, then looked back at her, his expression unreadable. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, the suspicion in his gaze turning cold. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you can't board," he said, his voice laced with a tone of finality. Ava's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice even but laced with confusion. "There must be some mistake. I'm in the first-class section." The pilot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to scrutinize her with a look that was both condescending and dismissive. "I don't believe you're on this flight," he repeated, his words deliberate. "You don't look like you belong here." Ava's mind raced as she processed what was happening. Her initial confusion began to give way to a mix of disbelief and frustration. This wasn't about a missed flight or a technicality. This was something deeper, something that felt disturbingly personal. For a moment, the terminal seemed to quiet around her, as if the world was holding its breath. Ava's grip on her briefcase tightened. Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Sir," she said slowly, choosing her words with precision, "I am a first-class passenger, and I am boarding this flight. Now." The pilot's eyes flickered, but he didn't budge. His stance was firm, as if he had made up his mind about her before she even spoke. Ava's mind whirred with 1,000 thoughts. This wasn't just about a boarding pass. This was about something far more insidious, something that ran deeper than the surface. This was about prejudice, plain and simple. In that moment, Ava knew that the fight she was about to face was not just for her seat on the plane. It was for her dignity, for justice, and for the countless others who had been subjected to the quiet cruelty of racial bias. Ava didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes unwavering as she looked the pilot in the eye. What happened next would not only change her life, it would send shockwaves through the entire airport, sparking a movement that none of them could have predicted. This was the beginning of something far bigger than a flight. It was the beginning of a fight for justice, for equality, and for the resilience of one woman who refused to be silenced. Ava stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, but her expression unwavering. The pilot's words had hit her like a slap in the face. "You don't look like you belong here." They were haunting, ringing in her ears, and yet, they were all too familiar. They were words, thinly veiled in politeness, that she had heard before. Words she had grown accustomed to over the years in boardrooms, conferences, and even on the streets. But today, in this moment, in this place where she was supposed to be celebrating the fruits of her labor, those words felt different. They felt like an attack, a rejection of everything she had worked so hard for. The pilot's cold, scrutinizing gaze made it clear that he was not interested in hearing her explanations. He had already made up his mind. He saw her, a successful, confident black woman, and in his narrow, prejudiced worldview, she couldn't possibly belong in the first-class cabin. She couldn't possibly be someone who had earned the right to travel in the lap of luxury. The notion was so alien to him, so inconceivable, that he could only respond with disdain. Ava's mind raced as she weighed her options. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, the quiet murmurs, the sudden stillness in the terminal. Some passengers had stopped to watch, sensing the tension that was building between her and the pilot. It was a strange kind of silence, the kind that fills the air before a storm breaks. Ava had no intention of backing down, but she knew that how she responded in this moment would define the outcome of this encounter, and possibly, the course of her future. Taking a deep breath, she locked eyes with the pilot, her posture straightening even further, every inch of her body projecting authority. She would not let him see the flicker of vulnerability that wanted to creep in, the self-doubt that tried to surface in the wake of his accusations. This wasn't just about a first-class seat, this was about something far more significant. It was about reclaiming her space, her dignity, and standing firm in the face of discrimination that had followed her throughout her life. "Sir," she said again, her voice calm but firm, "I am a first-class passenger on this flight, and I demand to be treated with the same respect that any other paying customer would be." For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in the pilot's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by stubbornness. He seemed unwilling to accept the truth of the situation, as though his prejudice had convinced him that there was no possible way a woman like Ava could be a legitimate passenger. His gaze shifted to her briefcase, his eyes narrowing as though he were inspecting every detail of her being. It was as though he was looking for a reason to dismiss her, as though her presence itself was an anomaly that didn't fit within the narrow confines of his worldview. Ava could feel her pulse quicken, but she refused to let anger cloud her judgment. She had spent years cultivating a calm exterior, learning to navigate spaces where she was often the only black woman in the room, where her intelligence was questioned before her ideas were even heard. But this was different. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, and she wasn't going to let it go unchallenged. "You're not going to stop me," she said, her voice unwavering now. "I am here to board my flight, and I will not be delayed by your ignorance." The pilot's lips twisted into a condescending smile, but it was the kind of smile that did not reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that had been perfected by people who saw themselves as superior, who felt entitled to make others feel small. Ava could see it all too clearly. She had seen it in the eyes of colleagues who had underestimated her because of her race. She had seen it in the dismissive gestures of those who thought they knew better. But she had learned, over the years, to stand tall against that kind of arrogance. As she prepared to push forward, the ground attendant who had been watching quietly up until now stepped forward, her expression tense. Ava could see the hesitation in the woman's eyes. She didn't want to get involved in whatever was happening between the pilot and the passenger. But the attendant, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond the ordinary exchange, seemed to brace herself. "I'm sorry, but I need to see your boarding pass again," the attendant said, her voice trembling slightly as she reached for Ava's pass. Ava handed it over without hesitation, her fingers steady, despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. The attendant glanced down at the pass and then up at the pilot, who still stood with an air of superiority, arms crossed and expression fixed. It was clear that this wasn't about checking the legitimacy of her ticket, it was about something deeper, something rooted in prejudice. Ava's heart sank as she realized that the pilot had no intention of backing down, no matter what. The seconds dragged on, and Ava could feel the weight of every gaze in the terminal on her. Some passengers were whispering, some were watching with curiosity, and others seemed uncomfortable with the tension that was building. But there was one thing Ava knew for certain: she was not going to let this man make her feel less than what she was. She was not going to let him define her worth based on the color of her skin. She was a successful businesswoman, a force to be reckoned with, and she would not be intimidated by anyone, especially not by someone who was so clearly blinded by ignorance. "Ma'am," the pilot said again, his voice now tinged with frustration. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. We're holding up the boarding process." Ava's gaze flickered to the boarding area behind her, where passengers were beginning to gather in line. She could hear the sound of the announcer calling for passengers to board, the hum of voices blending into the background. But Ava's focus never wavered. She knew that this wasn't just about one incident. It was about the message that would be sent if she gave in. If she allowed this man to question her right to board a flight that she had every right to be on, it would reinforce the very prejudices that had kept her and so many others from succeeding in spaces they had earned the right to be in. Without warning, the sound of heavy footsteps approached from behind. Ava turned slightly, surprised to see Derek standing at the entrance of the gate area. Her husband had arrived just in time to witness the growing confrontation, and his presence brought a sense of relief to Ava's tight chest. Derek, tall and broad-shouldered, exuded a quiet strength that complemented Ava's confidence. His calm, steady presence had always been a grounding force in her life. Derek's eyes immediately locked onto the scene unfolding before him. His gaze flickered between Ava and the pilot, his expression darkening with each passing second. He was no stranger to the challenges that Ava faced as a black woman in a world that often underestimated her, but seeing her treated this way was different. This wasn't just an encounter he could brush off. This was an attack on Ava's dignity, on everything they had fought for as a couple. He stepped forward, his voice low but filled with authority. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the pilot's face. The pilot looked up at Derek, sizing him up with the same prejudice he had directed at Ava. But Derek was not a man to be easily intimidated. He stepped closer to the situation, his body language radiating the same strength that had always defined their relationship. "This woman is a first-class passenger on this flight," Derek continued, his voice firm. "And I suggest you let her board." The pilot's eyes flickered for a moment, and for the first time, Ava could see a crack in his facade. But he didn't back down. He was too stubborn, too entrenched in his own biases, to admit fault. Derek stood his ground. "If you don't let her board this flight, I'll be filing a formal complaint. And I will make sure this gets to the highest levels of the airline. Believe me, this will not go unnoticed." For a moment, there was silence, the weight of Derek's words hanging in the air. The pilot hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as though he were trying to come up with a defense that could hold water. But there was nothing. His prejudice had no place in the face of Derek's calm resolve. Finally, with a begrudging nod, the pilot stepped aside. Ava didn't wait another second. She walked past him, her head held high, the final act of defiance, completing the small but significant victory. As she passed Derek, she squeezed his hand, grateful for his unwavering support. But this moment wasn't over. It wasn't just about getting on the plane. It was about the ripple effect that this encounter would create. It was about standing up against the quiet, pervasive racism that so many people like Ava had faced for years. She had just taken a stand, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every person who had ever been dismissed because of who they were. This was just the beginning. As Ava made her way down the jet bridge, she could feel the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders. The moment she had passed the pilot, she had reclaimed her space, but the tension in her body, the adrenaline that had been coursing through her veins, had yet to dissipate. She had done what she had to do to protect herself, to stand her ground against the quiet injustice that had tried to undermine her. But now, as she took each step toward the plane, there was an odd mixture of relief and anger. The relief was for the fact that she had successfully boarded the flight. The anger, however, was for the injustice that had almost denied her that simple right. Derek had followed her onto the jet bridge, his presence still a steady comfort behind her. His protective instinct had kicked in as soon as he saw what was happening, and she had been grateful for his intervention. But it was also more than that. Derek had always been her partner, her equal, and he had always known when to step up and when to give her the space to handle things on her own. In this moment, though, he had stood beside her, an unspoken promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. As they boarded the plane, Ava felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. This was her seat, her ticket, and she was going to sit in it without hesitation. She had earned it. She was worthy of it. No one could take that away from her, not even the pilot who had tried to diminish her. She could feel the eyes of the flight attendants as she passed, and for a brief moment, she wondered if they were aware of what had just transpired. Would they say something? Would they turn their backs? But no, they simply smiled and greeted her as they did with every passenger, treating her with the same professionalism they afforded to everyone else. The cabin was quiet, and as Ava settled into her seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the residual anger from the encounter with the pilot, it was something deeper. Something that had been simmering under the surface for so long. For years, Ava had been breaking down barriers, proving herself time and time again in spaces that were not designed for her. She had learned to fight for her place, to show up even when it felt like the odds were stacked against her. But today, something had shifted. She wasn't just fighting for her place in the business world anymore. She was fighting for her dignity, for the right to exist in a world that often tried to diminish her. Derek sat next to her, his hand resting on hers, a small but significant gesture of solidarity. He had witnessed so many of these moments in their relationship, the moments when Ava had been underestimated, dismissed, or ignored because of her race. He had seen her work twice as hard to prove herself in every room she entered, and he had admired her resilience. But he had never seen her fight like this before. He had never seen her fight for something so fundamentally personal, so deeply rooted in her identity. "Are you okay?" Derek asked quietly, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Ava nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed the answer. "I'm fine. I'm just tired, you know," she said, her voice trailing off as she glanced out of the window. The plane was starting to taxi down the runway, and the roar of the engines seemed to drown out everything else for a moment. But the calmness of the flight couldn't erase the storm that had just passed through the terminal. Ava's thoughts were swirling, her mind racing as she replayed the events of the past hour. She had stood up for herself, yes, but in the process, she had been forced to confront something much bigger. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't the first time that someone had questioned her worth simply because of her race. But it was different today. Today, she had stood her ground. She hadn't let it slide, hadn't let it go unchallenged. She had demanded to be treated with respect. It wasn't just about getting on the flight. It was about sending a message that she wouldn't allow anyone to diminish her, no matter how subtle or insidious the attack. And that message was something she wanted to hold on to, something she wanted to share with others who had been through similar experiences. As the plane lifted off the ground, Ava felt herself settling into her seat, her body finally relaxing as the plane climbed higher into the sky. But her mind was still racing. She could feel the echoes of the pilot's words reverberating in her thoughts, his gaze still burning into her memory. "You don't look like you belong here." The words, as simple as they were, had cut deeper than she cared to admit. They weren't just about one man's personal bias, they were a reflection of a society that had always struggled to accept Black people, particularly Black women, in spaces of power and influence. The truth was, Ava had never been given anything for free. Everything she had achieved, she had fought for. She had started from nothing, building her business from the ground up, proving herself in a world that often saw her as an outsider. She had faced countless challenges, and she had been forced to navigate a corporate landscape that wasn't designed for someone like her. But despite all the obstacles, she had made it. She had built a successful company, had gained the respect of her peers, and had created a life for herself that many people would envy. But even now, in moments of triumph, the world reminded her of its biases. The pilot's actions had been a stark reminder that no matter how far she had come, no matter how much success she had achieved, there were still people out there who saw her as less than. And that was what made her angry. Not the fact that she had been stopped from boarding the flight, but that this was the reality she had to live with. This was the reality that millions of Black women had to navigate every single day. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise in her mind. She was determined not to let this moment define her, but the truth was, it was hard not to feel the weight of it. She had fought so hard to create a space for herself, to carve out a place where she could succeed on her own terms, but the fight was never really over. Every success was tempered by the knowledge that there would always be someone who would try to pull her down, to remind her that she didn't belong. Derek squeezed her hand gently, pulling her out of her thoughts. "We'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "You're not alone in this, Ava. I've got your back." Ava smiled faintly, grateful for his unwavering support. Derek had always been there for her, through every challenge, every obstacle. He had never once questioned her ability to succeed. He had always believed in her, even when the world tried to make her feel small. But as much as she appreciated his support, she knew that this fight wasn't just about her and Derek. It was about something bigger. It was about the countless other Black women who had faced similar prejudices, similar moments of doubt, similar fights for their place in the world. This was about them, too. "I know," Ava said, her voice steady now. "But I'm not sure what to do next. It's not just about me. It's about everything. Everything we've fought for, everything we've overcome, everything we still have to fight against. I can't just forget what happened today. I can't pretend like it didn't happen." Derek nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "You don't have to forget, Ava. You don't have to pretend. But you don't have to let it define you either. What happened today, it was wrong. And people need to know about it. They need to see it for what it is." Ava nodded, feeling the resolve settle in her chest. Derek was right. She didn't have to carry the burden of this experience alone. She didn't have to let it consume her, but she also couldn't ignore the impact it had on her. She had a voice, and it was time to use it. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence, but Ava's mind was no longer occupied with the anger that had consumed her earlier. Now, it was filled with thoughts of what to do next. She knew she couldn't let this moment fade into the background. She knew that she had to speak out, to ensure that what had happened to her wasn't just a fleeting incident. She had the platform, the audience, the voice. And she wasn't going to let it go to waste. As the plane soared through the sky, Ava made a decision. She wasn't going to let the pilot's actions be forgotten. She was going to make sure the world knew what had happened to her, and she was going to use her platform to demand change. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, every person who had been dismissed or ignored because of their identity. It was time to turn this moment into something bigger, to turn it into a movement that would inspire others to stand up, speak out, and fight for what was right. The turbulence of the moment had passed, but the ripple effect was just beginning. The days that followed Ava's encounter at the airport felt like a blur. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a deep sense of urgency, a burning desire to make sure that what had happened to her wouldn't simply fade into obscurity. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the fight she had fought in that terminal wasn't just about her own dignity, it was about something much larger. The prejudice she had faced wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a wider issue that Black women, and people of color in general, were all too familiar with. Ava had never been one to back down from a challenge. Her career had been built on the belief that anything was possible if you were willing to work for it, to show up every day with the kind of determination and perseverance that couldn't be ignored. But this fight was different. It wasn't something she could conquer with sheer willpower alone. This was a systemic issue, something that needed to be confronted at its root. It wasn't just about one racist pilot or one incident at an airport. It was about a culture of exclusion, of bias, of prejudice that had been ingrained in the fabric of society for far too long. The first thing Ava did was reach out to her lawyer. She had always been proactive about her legal rights. She knew how important it was to protect herself in the business world, where contracts could be broken and deals could be undone in an instant. But this situation was personal. It wasn't about protecting her business empire or securing another deal. It was about standing up for herself as a Black woman, as a human being who had been wronged. She knew that if she didn't take action, if she didn't make sure that this pilot was held accountable for his actions, it would set a dangerous precedent. Ava's lawyer, a woman named Jasmine who had been with her since the early days of her business, was immediately on board. Jasmine had always been sharp, meticulous, and determined, qualities that Ava valued deeply. But this case, Jasmine knew, was different. It wasn't just a legal matter, it was a social one. It was an opportunity to make a statement, to bring attention to a pervasive issue that affected so many people in ways that often went unnoticed. As Ava and Jasmine began to strategize their next steps, Ava also realized that this wasn't a fight she could take on alone. It was time to speak up, to use her platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. She had a powerful network, business colleagues, mentors, industry leaders, but she also had a presence in the public eye. Her success had brought her into the spotlight, and it was time to leverage that spotlight for something more important than just personal gain. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without making a real difference. Ava knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She had been in enough boardrooms, enough high-stakes meetings, to know how quickly people could try to sweep things under the rug. She had seen the way institutions and corporations sometimes turned a blind eye to issues of racism and discrimination. She had heard the stories of people who had fought for justice, only to have their voices ignored or dismissed. But Ava was determined to ensure that this wasn't one of those stories. She wasn't just going to be another person who had an unpleasant experience and did nothing about it. She wasn't going to let this moment slip by. She wasn't going to be quiet. The first public step Ava took was to release a statement. It wasn't an easy decision, especially knowing that once the story was out there, there would be no turning back. But Ava was resolute. She sat down at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, as she began to write. She didn't want to sugarcoat anything. She didn't want to minimize what had happened. She wanted to be honest, raw, and unflinching. The statement, when it was finally published, was a powerful declaration of her experience. She described the events of that day in detail, recounting the moments of disbelief and confusion as the pilot questioned her right to board the flight. She spoke candidly about the anger she felt, but also about the resolve that had carried her through. She talked about the impact that racism had on her, not just as a businesswoman, but as a Black woman navigating a world that often told her she didn't belong. And, perhaps most importantly, she called on others to stand with her, to speak out against the prejudice that was so ingrained in society, to refuse to be complicit in the face of injustice. The response to her statement was overwhelming. Within hours, it went viral. Messages of support poured in from people all over the world, many of them sharing their own stories of similar experiences, stories of being overlooked, dismissed, and disregarded because of their race. The solidarity was palpable, and it gave Ava a renewed sense of purpose. She had made the right decision by speaking up. The world was listening. But with the support also came the backlash. There were those who sought to discredit Ava, to paint her as someone who was overreacting, someone who was stirring up trouble where none existed. Some commenters accused her of playing the race card, of exaggerating the situation. Others tried to paint her as an angry Black woman who couldn't handle a simple misunderstanding. But Ava wasn't surprised. She had been through this before. She had seen how people who spoke out against injustice were often vilified, dismissed, or silenced. But she wasn't going to let the hate get to her. She wasn't going to let their words undermine everything she was trying to accomplish. Instead, she leaned into the criticism. She used it as fuel. She didn't engage with the trolls or the people who sought to diminish her voice. Instead, she focused on the real conversations that were happening, the conversations about race, power, and inequality that had been ignited by her statement. She used her platform to continue the dialogue, to encourage others to share their own experiences, to demand accountability from institutions, and to challenge the status quo. Ava's next step was to bring the issue to the airline itself. She wanted to ensure that the pilot was held accountable for his actions, but she also wanted to see systemic change. It wasn't enough for her to simply ensure that this one pilot was reprimanded. She wanted to make sure that the airline took meaningful steps to address racism and discrimination within its ranks. She demanded a meeting with the airline's executives, and when they agreed, she made sure to come prepared. She had done her research. She had gathered evidence. She had a plan. When the day of the meeting arrived, Ava walked into the boardroom with a sense of determination. She was dressed in a sharp suit, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture straight. She knew that this meeting wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she had a responsibility to speak up, to push for change. As she sat across from the airline executives, she could feel the weight of the moment. She was here not just for herself, but for every person who had been overlooked or silenced because of their race. The meeting was tense, but Ava was unyielding. She spoke about her experience, laying out the details of what had happened in the terminal. She didn't hold back. She spoke about the emotional toll that the incident had taken on her, about how it had brought up years of frustration and anger that she had carried with her in silence. She talked about the wider impact of racism, about how it wasn't just an individual problem, it was a societal one that needed to be addressed head-on. She demanded that the airline take action, that they implement training and policies to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. She didn't want an apology. She wanted real, tangible change. The executives listened, their faces tight, but they couldn't argue with the facts. Ava had laid out her case with clarity and conviction, and they knew that they couldn't simply dismiss her. It wasn't just about the pilot anymore, it was about the larger issue that Ava had raised. They agreed to a series of measures that would include diversity and inclusion training for their employees, a review of their hiring practices, and a commitment to hold their staff accountable for discriminatory behavior. Ava left the meeting feeling both exhausted and hopeful. She had taken a stand, and she had made a difference. The road ahead was still long, but this was a crucial step forward. The airline had listened, and they had promised to do better. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the final solution to the problem of racism in society, but it was a start. As Ava boarded her flight home, she felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. She had faced down her fears, challenged the systems that had tried to silence her, and fought for change. And she knew that this was just the beginning. Her journey wasn't over, it had only just begun. She was ready to keep pushing forward, to keep raising her voice, to keep fighting for the dignity and respect that every person, regardless of their race, deserved. The weeks that followed Ava's meeting with the airline's executives brought with them a whirlwind of media attention, public support, and a renewed sense of purpose. Her story had ignited conversations that were long overdue, and the ripple effects of her stand against prejudice began to spread far beyond the airport terminal. Ava had always been accustomed to attention, but this was different. The platform she had built, the business empire she had painstakingly constructed, had become the vehicle for something much larger than herself. As she watched the conversations unfold across social media, news outlets, and within her own circle of influence, Ava found herself grappling with a feeling she hadn't fully anticipated: hope. For years, she had fought for recognition in spaces that weren't designed for people like her. She had pushed through barriers, overcoming the biases of colleagues, clients, and peers, but this moment felt different. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small, overlooked, or excluded because of who they were. It was about bringing to light the unspoken, everyday prejudices that had quietly shaped so much of her life and the lives of others like her. In the days after her statement went viral, Ava received messages from all corners of the world. People of all races, backgrounds, and professions shared their own stories of discrimination and prejudice. Many were Black women, like herself, who had experienced similar dismissals and assumptions simply because of their race or gender. They had faced the same biases, the same subtle, insidious acts of racism that tried to erase their presence in spaces where they had every right to be. And yet, despite the hardships, many of them had never spoken up, fearing that their voices would be drowned out, that they would be dismissed as angry or irrational. Ava's decision to share her story had given them the courage to speak out as well. Messages of solidarity poured in, not only from individuals but from organizations, allies, and activists who were committed to the fight for racial justice. It was as though a dam had broken open, and people were finally beginning to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been ignored for far too long. But Ava was also acutely aware of the complexities of her newfound platform. With the support came the criticism, the detractors who saw her as a threat to the status quo, the people who felt uncomfortable with the spotlight shining on these issues. Many of them took to social media to try to discredit her, accusing her of fabricating the story or exaggerating the events. They tried to paint her as someone who was trying to stir up division, to create a narrative of victimhood that they felt was unnecessary. At first, the criticism stung. It always did. No one ever wanted to be the target of hate or negativity, especially when the fight they were fighting was so personal. But Ava had learned over the years how to navigate the noise, how to focus on what truly mattered. She knew that the loudest voices were often the ones trying to hold on to a system that benefited them, one that relied on the silencing of marginalized voices. And she wasn't about to let that happen. She responded to the criticism not with anger, but with clarity. She shared more stories, more experiences, from herself and others, offering a glimpse into the daily realities of living in a world where people of color were constantly asked to prove their worth, to justify their place in spaces that should have been accessible to everyone. She shared research, statistics, and expert opinions that highlighted the prevalence of racial bias, not just in the workplace, but in every aspect of life, from education and healthcare to the criminal justice system and beyond. Ava wasn't just defending her own experience, she was standing up for the millions of people who had been denied their right to exist in peace, to occupy spaces without fear of judgment or exclusion. She understood that this was about building something bigger than herself. It was about changing the narrative, challenging the assumptions, and dismantling the systems of power that had for too long upheld inequality. Meanwhile, the airline had begun to implement some of the measures they had promised. Ava had stayed in close contact with the executives, ensuring that the actions they were taking weren't just performative, but that they were truly committed to creating change. It wasn't easy. Change never was. But the dialogue that had been sparked by her actions was undeniable. The airline had committed to greater diversity in their hiring practices, and they had begun rolling out comprehensive anti-racism and diversity training for their staff. Ava was cautiously optimistic, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for racial equity was a long one, and one isolated incident, however impactful, wasn't going to undo the years of systemic oppression that had been entrenched in institutions and industries. In the midst of all this, Ava found herself reflecting on the woman she had become. The woman who had walked into that airport, polished and poised, ready to board a flight to celebrate her hard-earned success, but who had been stopped in her tracks by prejudice. That woman was still inside her, but she had been transformed. She wasn't just a businesswoman anymore, she was an advocate, a voice for those who had been silenced, and a force for change. She had learned the power of speaking out, of standing firm in the face of injustice, and she had come to understand that her success was not just for herself, it was for the countless others who had fought for the right to be seen and heard. Ava knew that the battle for racial justice was far from over. It was not just about changing the attitudes of individuals, but about transforming entire systems and structures. She was keenly aware of the work that still lay ahead, the long road that stretched out before her, but she was no longer daunted by it. She had seen the impact of one voice, one story, one act of defiance. And she knew that together, with others who were willing to stand up and speak out, change was possible. She began to take on a more active role in various advocacy organizations, lending her voice to causes that aligned with her values. She used her platform to raise awareness, to mobilize her community, and to challenge the industries and systems that perpetuated inequality. She partnered with groups that provided resources and support to Black women entrepreneurs, working to break down the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Ava's own journey had been shaped by the mentors and allies who had helped her along the way, and now, she wanted to pay it forward. One evening, as Ava sat in her office, reviewing a proposal for a new initiative aimed at supporting minority-owned businesses, she received a call that would mark another pivotal moment in her journey. It was Derek, and his voice was filled with excitement. "Ava, you've been nominated for the Global Diversity Leadership Award," he said, the pride in his voice unmistakable. Ava sat back in her chair, stunned for a moment. It was an unexpected recognition, and yet it felt like a reflection of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, not just for her own success, but for the success of those who had been overlooked, dismissed, and left behind. This was a recognition not just of her business achievements, but of her unwavering commitment to pushing for change, to making space for others, and to using her voice to bring attention to the issues that mattered most. The award was a turning point for Ava. It wasn't the end of her journey, but a moment to pause, to reflect on how far she had come and how much further there was to go. She accepted the award with humility, acknowledging the countless others who had walked beside her, who had fought their own battles, and who had inspired her to keep going. She knew that this was not just her victory, it was a collective one. As Ava stood on the stage to accept the award, her thoughts went back to that moment in the airport terminal, the moment when she had felt the weight of prejudice press against her, when she had been forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that even success couldn't shield her from the biases of the world. But in that moment, she had found her voice. She had turned that moment of injustice into a catalyst for change, and she had used her experience to spark a movement. The applause that filled the room was not just for her, but for everyone who had been part of this journey. It was for the Black women who had fought for their place in the world, for the allies who had stood beside them, and for the countless others who had refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. Ava had learned something invaluable through this journey, that change doesn't come from waiting for someone else to speak up, it comes from finding the courage to speak for yourself and to stand up for others who can't. And in doing so, you create a legacy that is far greater than any one individual achievement. As Ava stepped off the stage, she knew that this was just another beginning. The fight for justice, for equality, for dignity, was ongoing. And she was ready to keep pushing forward, to keep using her voice to shape a future where no one would ever have to face the kind of prejudice she had encountered that day. It was a future she was determined to help create, one that would reflect the values of fairness, respect, and equality for all. The journey was far from over, but with every step, she was making it a little bit easier for the next person to walk in her shoes.